Hello and welcome to the National Library's Singapore Signature Program for Conversations. My name is Ashif from the National Library's engagement team. There's always something to discover at the library where we seek to ignite passion for learning through our collections, services, and programs. For Conversations is where we bring together thought leaders to share new possibilities for the future, inspire lifelong learning, and the creation of new knowledge based on the theme New Thinking for a New World. We are very excited that over the next 2 days, our local and international speakers will break down the changes in the future of work, our well-being, the art scene, and development of urban design. And to kick off the first conversations on the future of work, we have Ms. Liana Tang, who will be moderating this session. Liana is Deputy Director at the Center for Strategic Futures in Singapore. And as part of today's conversation, we have specially put together a resource guide that you can refer to if you would like to learn more about this topic. And you can access it through the QR code and the link that we'll be putting up later.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a great way to start the morning talking about the future, something that I particularly enjoy from my background as a futurist at the Center for Strategic Futures in Singapore. And it's a great pleasure that we have two distinguished speakers today that can join me on this conversation about the future of work. We have Marina Gorbis, the Managing Director of the Institute for the Future, think tank based in Palo Alto. And we also have Managing Director at the ThinkPlace, Bill Bannear, with us today. So we're all futurists here, and we do spend most of our time thinking about the future. And so it's really always fun to share some of this thinking with a broader audience and to think about what your views are also of the future. Now, today's conversation this morning has to do with the future of work. Many people are really interested in this topic. I think it's for obvious reasons. It impacts all of us in some way or another. We know that there's also a lot of uncertainty around the future in terms of work. It's not only because we make an income from work, but a lot of the time we do also develop a very strong identity with work. And a lot of what we do in life, whether it's learning or play, it's also very linked to what we think work ought to be, how we think work ought to define us as well. So it's no surprise that this is a very popular topic, and that from time to time people are always thinking about it. But I think right now it's particularly timely to think about this because of just how transformative the current situation is with COVID-19. But what's really interesting is that even though COVID-19 is a universal event, its impact is far from universal. We do see that some industries are more impacted than others, some kinds of jobs more impacted than others, some personal lives more impacted than others. Right now, we are seeing in terms of jobs, the highest levels of unemployment since, at least in Singapore, the highest levels of unemployment since the financial crisis in 2009. The levels of retrenchments and displacements are higher than what we've seen in the past decade. There's been a lot that's been done to address this. Governments around the world are incurring a lot of debt trying to bail out certain industries, trying to channel aid to specific job support as well. And in Singapore, that is no different. But I think one way to think about the future of work for today's conversation, because it ranges such a big range from how industry is impacted, how skills impacted, how people are impacted. I thought we could take a futurist lens for today's conversation and think about three kinds of futures. First, the feared future, which is, I think, a very natural destination for our minds to always go to. Our transformed future, how things have changed either for the better or the worse. But what are some elements of this transformed future could take us to the uncertain future, which will be the end of this conversation, where I think I would like our panelists to think about what about today will stay for the next 5-10 years. What are the things we're doing today because of how the pandemic has transformed the way we work? What kinds of unintended consequences might there be in the future? So we're going to take this sort of a futures journey this morning, and it's going to be a conversational approach. There's also an opportunity for you to participate through the chat, so please do put in some questions that I'll give a signal boost when it comes to the appropriate juncture. So let's talk about the feared future first. I think this is something we really do need to get off our minds. And for many people, we would like to say, I like to think that the feared future, the so-called future of work, is already here. For many decades, people have been talking about how we will see mass displacements in the future. Usually these forces have to do with technology and automation, but the force that we're seeing today is the global pandemic. We are also seeing how ways that work has been transformed have had a very negative impact on some people, but a very positive impact on some people. So as predicted, the way we've been displaced has been uneven, and the impact of how we've been displaced is uneven. Now, I would like to then pose our first question to our speakers and kickstart the conversation on this feared future. Can you reflect on how we got here, Bill and Marina? Why are we in this feared future? What were the trends brewing prior to COVID-19 that have accelerated the future of work for us to go from basically what we thought was status quo to what we like to say the third horizon in the future, just like that, and people are just really caught by surprise? What are your reflections?
Who would you like to kick off, Liana?
Let's have Marina.
Sure, and great to be with you. It's evening here where I am in Silicon Valley in Palo Alto, so it's good evening for me and good morning for you. You know, what I'm seeing is that, first of all, this future has been happening for decades now. What we're experiencing today is kind of an acceleration of the kind of things that have been building up for decades. But what happens in pandemics, and there is a famous historian of pandemics, and he compares it to dramas in 4 acts. Act 1 is progressive revelation. So that's when things that were hidden or suppressed or we couldn't talk about them, all of a sudden you can't do that anymore, and they just kind of burst into the open. So I think we're still, the second act is random response. And, you know, from where I sit in the US, we're still in this random response phase. We're sort of in between, actually, the progressive revelation as things are coming out all the time, new things that kind of were building up, but were sort of inconvenient conversations I didn't want to talk about. And this kind of random response, do we open, do we not, do we wear a mask, do we not wear a mask? Is it 6 feet distance or is it 14 feet? It's all very random right now. Probably not like that in Singapore, but at least here in the US. So what is being revealed today, as I said, something that's been going on for several decades, which is that we're seeing this immense sort of polarization in terms of work. So there is a certain percent of the population that's hardly affected by it. They're able to work from home. They're able to do setup. Also, they probably have the resources, savings, and kind of a bit of economic security to weather through this. And then we have a very different pattern of work. We have people, and unfortunately, a lot of them are what we call essential workers here. You know, people who are doing delivery, people who are providing care for children, for older people, all kinds of other people in those that here in the US are usually low-wage occupations. And we just completed work where we've done interviews and panels with these workers. And I can tell you that the patterns of work and how these people living and the kind of economy they live in, they're so different that it's almost like we're living in completely different world. And this kind of polarization, if you look at what's been happening for the last several decades, actually in the US since the 70s, which is the level of wealth inequality has been increasing, the levels of income inequalities. We've had this polarization, kind of the demise a lot of the middle class population. So that's been going on, but it's now so obvious and it's now so extreme. So the pandemic kind of accelerated these things, but it's not that it wasn't happening.
And if I can jump in there, I might just start by thanking our hosts for bringing together this conversation. I think the 4 Conversation series is a really interesting set of conversations that they've set up for Singapore citizens. I love libraries. They have a great place in our society, and it's good to see the continual evolution of what libraries do. This is a bit of an analogy for the future of work. If you look at how libraries have changed and how they've shifted online and how they've changed the way that they provide knowledge in new forms, it's a nice analogy for what's happening in the world of work, I think. Just to pick up on some of the concepts that Marina spoke about, and maybe just my own viewpoint here is not as someone who spends a lot of time directly researching the future of work, but more working with organizations to help them do those transformations and understand where they might be going. I think most of my comments do tend to focus around the professional work life, less so for unskilled labor. And so that's quite a different story, as Marina mentioned. But I think that gets me to the 3 big trends that I think were already here that have been accelerated or brought into relief by the pandemic. I think the first one is a real shift in how we think about our workplaces and how we organize as groups of people to work, where the old mindset was really one geared around factories and efficiency. There was a whole philosophy of work around scientific managerialism that basically said, you have a class of very smart people who do all the thinking, and then you have people who do the working, and they don't necessarily connect apart from getting orders. So it's a very hierarchical way of thinking about organizations, and there's a distinct kind of class aspect to it as well. That's been broken down a lot in the last 30 or 40 years. And I think what we're seeing now is a desire to shift from that mentality of just do what the boss says in a kind of command and control or KPI driven culture, to we're actually a network that has to work together well to get the job done. And that means that there are different mindsets and behaviors that we need. And this is an old story. I don't think that's just now. This has been happening for a long time, but it's a shift in how we think about work. I think the second one, which Marina already mentioned, is the fault lines in society that have been emerging. I'm not just thinking about Singapore here, I'm thinking about my own home country of Australia, what we can see in the US, but also the debates that are happening in Singapore at the moment around national identity, about social integration, and what it means to be a city-state right now, where you have no choice to be connected to the world, but how do you look after your own citizenry? How do you get the balance right? How do you see the opportunity of working within that world in a way that's going to work for Singapore? But that means a focus on inequality, a focus on who loses out in a situation like the pandemic, and how to take care of people who end up on the wrong side of that. I think the third big one that's always been here, but depending on your society has been brushed under the carpet, it's climate change and the breakdown in the natural world and what's happening there. And in some ways, the pandemic has given us a bit of a reprieve in terms of economic activity and emissions. But where we go from here is now thoroughly intersecting with the impacts of climate change and a renewed call for sustainability in what we do. So we basically have, the pandemic is a real disruption and a problem. It's causing a lot of disruption and pain for many, many people in our society. There is also an opportunity in it to exercise some conscious choice about where we go from here. But we have to exercise that conscious choice, otherwise we'll just end up falling into the next pattern, which might not be what we want.
Thank you. So these are really rich points, and I would like to take some of these at the later part of the conversation. So please be prepared to elaborate on some of them because they're really good, especially when it has to do with fault lines, some of the hidden realities, Marina, that you talked about. Bill, where you talk about how there might be hidden cultural wars that are just brewing under the surface. I think we should talk about that in the later part of the conversation. And as well, some of these longer term issues that are probably as big or bigger of a crisis, and that has to do with climate change. And so before we do that, I wonder if you would like to reflect on what Marina talked about in terms of what current hidden realities are you also observing, Bill, in this transformation in the future of work?
So I think one of those realities is something that we saw when the pandemic first hit. It was a really strange moment for me because the circuit breaker actually coincided with the birth of my first child. So literally when we were in the hospital operating room giving birth was when the Prime Minister was announcing circuit breaker. So we went in, and when we came out, life had changed. And the very first day of circuit breaker was the first day we were back home. And I remember walking around the PLQ mall in Paya and watching everybody suddenly scramble to adjust to what had just been thrust on them. So there was this whole spirit of improvisation all of a sudden that I was seeing happening in real time as businesses tried to work out their take-home models in a matter of days, as people started to understand who could they afford to keep on, who are they going to have to lay off. How could a lot of companies were actually thinking, how can I keep my people working? Because if I let them go, that actually means I've lost a lot of my what makes my company great. And so how can I keep them on? And so everyone was suddenly in the spirit of improvisation. And while that was scary, and when we're talking about the feared future at the moment, there was a little bit of energy and dynamism that came with that, where we all got a shock out of our status quo. And there was this moment where we could suddenly think a little bit more clearly about what did we actually want to be doing. At the same time as that was happening, all of a sudden people had more time. Some people were flat out trying to manage that transition. And so, they were sort of caught up in all of that. But a lot of people suddenly found themselves with time on their hands to do things that they'd been putting off for a long time, to actually work on their business instead of in the business. So as the business as usual dropped off, people could suddenly get around to all those things that they'd meant to do to upgrade their businesses. We were actually doing research at the time into the SME Go Digital program. And so we'd done a set of interviews with small businesses before the pandemic, and we were doing them as the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden we saw businesses before where they said, it's just too hard. I can't, there's too much other stuff I've got to do. All of a sudden they're like, all right, okay, well, I guess I will now. And they suddenly discovered it was a lot easier than they thought to actually make that transition. But it comes back to, what are you focusing on? The urgent and immediate, or the urgent and long term, or sometimes just whoever's complaining most sort of takes your attention. So that's all a very long-winded way of saying that I think the pandemic brought about this spirit of improvisation. I think we're starting to see the tail end of that now. It goes back to Marina's model of the revelation followed by the sort of rapid response. Now we're starting to shift into that territory of what do we do next? What's the sort of more stable long-term forms that we want? And a lot of uncertainty still about what's going to come in the next few months and years.
So that's really interesting. I think it's really good that you also reminded us that there are some positive sides to this fiat future, which takes me takes us very nicely to this part of the conversation where I wanted to ask our speakers about what they think about a transformed future. And I think this is a nice segue also because I think not only have we seen spirits of innovation and creativity that we were surprised by, but also, Marina, you talked about the inequalities and the hidden dark realities that have also emerged. But we do see very interesting pivots that I think have been very unexpected during this time. I think things that you never thought could be done virtually have moved virtual. Who would have thought you could have a wedding solemnization virtually. You know, we had court hearings also virtually. When sentences were delivered over Zoom, it made the news, but people couldn't really figure out why it was newsy, right? But you knew it was something transformative. You knew that there was something strange about it, but you didn't know how to articulate it. And so I have a suspicion as to why, but I thought that this was an opportunity that to hear from you, Marina and Bill. How are some surprising ways you think we have seen major transformations that really are questioning some very fundamental parts of us, questioning very fundamental parts of humanity that people have been finding it really difficult to talk about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think one of the biggest impacts of where we are is that it kind of made us reassess a lot of things about our lives, about what is essential, who is essential, what kind of work is essential. It's almost like, I say, it's like we were looking at the world through some set of mirrors, and suddenly, and maybe it were crooked mirrors, and suddenly these mirrors broke, and you're like looking at everything, and you're really reassessing a lot of things in your life. From, for example, do I need to go to work every day? Do I need to work? Why is it 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or 8 to 6? You know, why? What is absolutely needed? How do I do? And, you know, we are improvising a lot. And in the process of improvisation, we just did our big conference that we used to do for almost 50 years in person. It was our biggest event. So we just had to move it to digital. And of course, it's a very different experience. But in the process, it just gave us all these new insights about what's possible. Like maybe we can reach, instead of 300 people, we can reach 2,000 people. You know, there are a lot of things. I think the other things that people are finding is that, you know, they're much more focused here in the US because we couldn't drive, and we focus on local. So all of a sudden people are so focused and really discovering their neighborhoods. The kind of like, I've taken walks around my neighborhood every day for months now, and I probably know every building. I discovered a lot of things in the process. And I also think like people are rethinking a lot of these, you know, the way I think about it is that how we cope with this moment. It's almost like, what kind of immune system, social immune system have we developed? Because the virus is the same around the world. And the virus is like, you know, if you look at sort of biology, right, we're constantly attacked by viruses and bacteria. And over time, you've developed a strong immune system, right, that kind of works, and you can survive those things. But if you have a weakened immune system, then you're not capable of responding in a kind of resilient way. So I think in many things, what's been very interesting and surprising and transformational is that it kind of reveals which countries, which cities, which governments, which societies have a pretty strong immune system. And unfortunately, in the US, it's revealed these vulnerabilities in our social immune system and all of these revelations. And that has been a surprise, because what it means is that all of us are rethinking our identity, where America is, what it means, where we are. You know, we always think of ourselves as sort of the innovators of the world, and we have these greatest companies, the biggest companies. And how is it possible that we have these largest companies, global companies, that all of a sudden can't supply masks or gloves, or, you know, we have we're running out of toilet paper. And it's just been such a shock to the system and people's, you know, our social identity and our individual identity. So it's, I think, the psychological impact of this for us in the US in particular, and probably for other places too, because, you know, I think underneath it, we're all kind of revealing what is that immune system that we have. And what is it that we need to fix to basically either rebuild or strengthen our immune system? Because as Bill said, it's kind of a preview. I feel like this particular pandemic is a kind of a gift in a way, because it's not as bad as it could be, right? But if we don't take it seriously, I mean, in many ways, what I always say is that what we're experiencing today is a result of decisions and actions that were taken decades ago, right? And they were just like, you know, we're all coping with crisis and we all need to do that. But this is also the moment where we're building scaffolding for the future. And these decisions and choices we make today will determine what's our immune system and how ultimately we're able to deal with that. And I just want to add kind of the thing that in addition to, you know, pandemic here in California, we're obviously been dealing with fires and climate crisis, real climate crisis, the kind of things we haven't experienced before ever. And so, you know, we're focusing a lot on thinking of the impact of automation. I think we need to focus more on the impact of climate change. And I totally agree with Bill. Like we didn't have enough firefighters. That's just it. And those are the, you know, the climate change is going to create really very different needs and requirements for the kind of work that needs to be done.
Maybe if I can just add to that before we go to the next question, I think what the pandemic has really thrown into relief is that tension between seeing ourselves as an economy and sort of widgets in that economy versus us as a society and humans in that society. And the pandemic has sort of stress tested our societies and our economies at the same time. And we've realized just how fundamentally linked they are. It's why it connects to the inequality agenda, because if you've got a lot of people who don't have the safety nets, who don't have the ability to cope, they have the ability, I mean, from a purely selfish point of view, they have the ability to harm others in that society around them. So you actually have to take the bigger sense of society and bring everybody along, or you end up with what's happening in various countries we see around the world, where there's a real decline in trust across those societies at the moment. And this, in some places, the pandemic has strengthened it. I think arguably in Singapore, it's strengthened it. And I think that one more interesting point around that is Singapore as a city-state of about 5 million people is just about the right size of a political entity to navigate something like this. Australia has struggled with its states and territories. It's done an okay job. New Zealand has done better. Again, you know, smaller population. One term for this is the ability as a society to undertake radical sacrifice to do what needs to be done to get the result. And a city-state can, a city can. A big country with that big imagined community, I think, is really struggling to do it at the moment.
And can I just add, I totally agree with Bill that I think there's a huge advantage to having a smaller country that's more connected and there with highest degree of trust, because if anything, this pandemic, it's undermining some of the kind of traditional beliefs, I think, that are very key to the US, which is around this rugged individualism. I do everything by myself. I'm this hero entrepreneur. I achieve it all by myself. It sort of worked for a certain period of time. But if anything, pandemic showed that there is no such thing like individual health or climate change. We can't deal with it on an individual or small scale. We're all interdependent. And so societies that have that kind of sense and belief in mutual codependence, interdependence, that we're all in this together, you know, that there is no such thing as individual health. All health is public health. You're only as healthy as a homeless person that's sleeping down the block with you, right? There's just no such thing. And I think that's why there's a huge advantage to societies that have this kind of sense of mutual obligation, of connectedness and mutual interdependence.
These are some really great points. And Marina, I love that you brought up this idea of a social immune system, because that relies on so many foundational factors, which you and Bill are both alluding to now. It's social resilience. It's also whether your structures and institutions are purposed rightly for facing any sort of crisis or range of crises. And I think it's also a very suitable analogy because every time when the system is infected, there is always a storm of a reaction. And depending on these foundational factors, the storm of the reaction could be a fever, or it could just be a cough, and I think seeing that range of reactions is also a very interesting indicator for how some of these foundational structures were before, and what some of these points of interventions might have to be better prepared for a pandemic or a similar kind of crisis in the future. And that will really take this really takes the conversation to the next part, where we want to think about, reflect a little bit more about what we're seeing today, what parts of it will remain, and how we can be better prepared for the future. Because I see quite a few questions in the chat that have to do with that. People want to know what now. But before we do that, maybe let's see what people are feeling in terms of their own personal outlooks in terms of their jobs. We have a poll that can come up now to give a quick reaction from the audience on where they are. So audience, you will see a poll coming up with some questions, so we can see where everyone else is on the spectrum of your biggest fear, since we just talked about our feared future. So Bill and Marina, can you see what I'm seeing? Mm-hmm. The results of the poll. So it's really interesting that I think option 1 and 3 are quite related, right? A machine could take over your skills, or you're just not prepared for the future in terms of your own skills. Technology aside, what are your quick reactions to this result?
I can try. I think there's a kind of a misconception, or the myth, that automation and technologies replace jobs. I think it's a fundamentally faulty, and there's a lot of research on that. Somebody looked at 100 occupations, just categories, over the last, all the occupations over the last 100 years in the US. And there was only one that doesn't exist anymore, and that's an elevator operator, right? Because that's been definitely replaced. So it's not that technologies replace, but there are a lot of ways in which technologies reshape our work. It reshapes how you access work. For example, you go on LinkedIn, or you do it online, or you fill out online surveys, as it used to be done differently. It changes kind of the nature of work, how work is distributed. So is it you go to platforms and, work is distributed in using algorithms, how you're paid, all these, there's probably 8 different ways in which technologies reshape how we do things. But even things like, a lot of people have been looking at trucking, for example, and it's not that automation is replacing trucking and truckers in general. It's changing how trucking is done. So more short haul, more sort of regional things, and less long haul trucking. And it does impact people's incomes and how the whole industry is organized. So I think it's important when we look at automation and technology, it's very specific to specific industries. And there is no generic sort of way of saying, oh, automation is going to do this and this and that. It's going to impact different industries differently. And you need to have a very sort of specific view of a particular industry. The other thing I want to say about skills, this is my personal view, and this is something that we've been looking at in terms of skills. I think there is a kind of a fundamental, it's very hard to predict what jobs will be in the future, right? Like if somebody tells you they know, just don't believe them. But it is, you can see what kind of skills people will need if you look at what's happening and what technologies are doing, what people are capable. But I also think there's just a fundamental set of human skills that we need to thrive in this world. And some of them are very old. Critical thinking, whatever work you do, and it's just not even your work, it's your life. You have to be making decisions in your life about your health, about your family, about your finances, all of these things. So critical thinking is a very necessary skill. I think despite the fact that we're all working digitally and, or a lot of people who are privileged and able to do it, we're all missing human contact. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised that post this, there's going to be a whole we're starved for human contact. We're social beings, you know. There's a kind of cues that we get from each other when we're in person that you just can't replace. There are a lot of things that we could be doing digitally, but I think the human and ability to communicate with humans and in different modes and through different media and being kind of literate in that, I think is a critical skill. Ability to say and verify and see what's true and what's not, and making that kind of judgment. We're surrounded by all kinds of disinformation, fake, all kinds of things. So ability to discern, I think is really important. And I do think that what we call computational thinking, which doesn't mean coding necessarily, but ability to basically understand very basic things about, it's kind of abstract, its ability to basically convey complex ideas and concepts in sort of simplified, simulated, or sort of computer language. I think it's a good skill to have, absolutely. So, but to me, like the basic human skills, particularly when we're looking at you know, where we are in terms of global political environment, in terms of climate change, in terms of all of these kinds of things, I would go with basic human skills.
And maybe if I was just sort of reflecting on what people really want to hear is, what skills should I be learning now so that I can be prepared? And unfortunately, the answer to that is it's hard to know. There's some obvious ones that for the next 5-10 years will probably be quite relevant. And if you're learning stuff around the new technologies that are emerging, that will probably be useful. But I don't think that's really how the story works. And I was just thinking about, I didn't expect to be here when I was trying to figure out what I should study in the last years of high school and what I should study in university. I think at that point, I wanted to work in the United Nations on sort of global issues. And I did an economics degree and an Asian studies degree. Honestly, I did the Asian studies degree because I thought it was interesting and I wanted to learn about the world. And I did an economics degree because I thought it would get me a job, but I don't know that I actually enjoyed it very much. And I've used the Asian studies a bit in the background. I've used the economics a bit in the background, but I've never used either of them professionally since. But they gave me that basic toolkit from which I could start to improvise the other things. And I think that's how the world of work works now. I think you need to be ready to pivot and learn new things, because there's a big difference between skills and what's on paper and just being useful, actually being useful in the workplace, being useful in a team, because if you're useful, if you've got that common sense, that ability to think something through, that ability to get on with people, that ability to communicate well, then the ability to plan, then that's always going to be useful. The actual specific thing on top, either you're going to be working alongside a deep specialist and they'll need you to give them those things that they haven't spent the time developing because they went really deep in a PhD on computer science. There's a need for those things. So everything that Marina said, I agree with. I think what it comes down to for me is a renewed focus on self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and what I've heard described as your emotional passport. Because the fundamental thing you need in this is your own resilience to survive all of those changes. And that's not something that most of us have been trained in. It's not something that's been a focus of our education systems in the past. So I think that's actually the critical bit. How do I actually develop that awareness of myself and my own emotions and the way that I'm relating to something that makes me better at learning, and it makes me better at working with people. The other part is that, another way that this is described is the notion of T-shaped people, which is not something that we developed. It's a model that we use where, the long part of the T is knowing a little bit about a lot of things so that you can relate to others from those disciplines. And then you might have a depth in something, and it doesn't really matter what your depth is in, because there will be a place for it. And you've got to be able to put it together with the other deep specializations that people have. Because just to come back to my opening point around this shift we've made from working in a factory and this idea of scientific managerialism to working in these networks, it is about how you can work together in a team with people and put together knowledge and do that in practice. So it's not about sort of writing research papers. It's about how do you actually actively get about solving problems together. And that's just as much about being able to get on with people in a team as it is about how intelligent you are, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say the T people, I was going to bring it up because I also feel like that notion of T people, and it's, you know, the generalist part of it. What's important is that being able to connect ideas between different disciplines and be able to translate them. And that's where, you know, you can have that deep knowledge in something and then connecting it and being able to translate from one discipline to another. I think that's a really, really important skill. But the other thing I just want to say, we're kind of in this world where so many notions of everything are being kind of upended. And, you know, if you're lucky enough, like I think of my own career, and also like Bill, I never expected to be doing what I'm doing now, but I kind of fell in love with it. And it's so important, just not just for my work, but it's just every day, I'm in love with it, what I'm doing, and it just makes my life better. So if you have that ability or luxury to just, and everybody, there's probably something that all of us have, right? That you're just like, I'm just in love with this thing and I'm gonna do it. I think about it no matter what I do and no matter, and if you can connect those two, I think that's the best possible scenario.
That being said, I know, you know, from my perspective, I'm speaking from a position of privilege. I'm seeing some comments in the chat line around, you know, what does this mean for people who've been working in more labor-oriented jobs? And I think I am disturbed about what the future is going to look like there, because the more we automate, whether it's through robotics and the physical side of things and the replacement of physical labor, or it's the replacement of cognitive labor with artificial intelligence, I think for people, for the humans who are working in that, alongside that, it's either they've got to bring their emotional sense to work, and that's what they're being valued for. It's about the service and human interaction that they can have. And while Google may be able to give you a great hairdressing appointment booking experience through a chatbot, I think there is still going to be a role for people valuing the humanity in service roles. Or it's people moving into more higher order judgments that they have to exercise. I think basically we are automating out a lot of the basic menial manual stuff, the sort of stuff that gets done in an Excel spreadsheet now. And that's being replaced by systems. But I mean, Marina, I'm curious to know, I think you have a sense that there will always be jobs, but particularly for the lower skilled sector of the economy. I'm curious to know your views on that.
Yeah, I actually, you know, that whole, I'm really not a fan of the low skill work. There is low wage work, but it doesn't necessarily mean low skill work. And that's something we've been working with a commission here on the future of work. And that's what I learned. You know, it takes a lot of skill to work in a restaurant. It takes a lot of skill, and people who do this work, it does, a lot of times it takes a lot of emotional intelligence too, because you still have to interact with people. What I'm seeing actually is automation creates actually more that kind of low wage, potentially low wage work. There's a kind of a last mile of automation where, you know, okay, you can have your automated delivery, but somebody still has to take it to your door or connect it. And in a lot of this work, we're seeing that, you know, there is a kind of a thing with automation where because it breaks down complex, like think about crafts work, right? It was complex work, right? You have to know. So automation and in manufacturing replaced that craft work with much more standardized work. It didn't replace workers, but we managed to be making more, right? So we're able to produce more. So it does, automation, as I said, it changes this nature of work. And it does kind of potentially create more this kind of routine. It's routinizing some of the work that was like financial services, for example. A lot of it is now, it's different because, you know, machines can do more processing, but you still have to communicate to clients about what the machines are telling you, right? So it is changing the nature, and as I said, in every industry, it's likely to be different. But, you know, on a kind of a larger scale, I think that with between the pandemic and the changes in technology and everything else and how we work, I do think that potentially we're very much have been in this kind of work-centric environment where our identity, our lives, our schedules have all been organized around work. And that identity, that's our social network. That's where we get our meaning and all of these. And one of the things I think that the pandemic is changing, it is kind of reshaping. It's like now we're working around our lives more. It's like we're not structuring as much our lives around work, or at least some people, right? And it's just giving us a very different sense. We've been living in this kind of work-centric world, but we may be moving into a different world where we could organize, where basically we work around our lives rather than the other way around.
Marina, that's a really interesting reflection, because I rather suspect it's quite polarized too. Just going back to one of your earlier points about how we're seeing a lot more polarization because of COVID-19. You know, our local news has been publishing quite a few polls around, you know, are you more productive in work from home conditions? Do you find that this has been better for you in terms of work life? Do you want to go back to work immediately, or do you want some blend? The results have actually been quite polarizing. I think we do see 40 to 50% of people saying I'm much more productive, and we see the opposite for the rest. And you do see also that certain parts of the population might be a lot more disadvantaged, just, you know, really just by virtue of, say, your gender roles in the household, also the type of work as well. You know, if one spouse, you know, has a job that pays a lot more, you end up, you know, the other spouse having to implicitly take on more roles in the household. And then that leads to all kinds of other issues, whether it's identity or it's precarity in terms of their current job. So I just wanted to put that out there. But before I think we move on to really unpack some of these areas, see the longer term impacts, for example, of what's happening today, I thought we could circle back because there are some questions that are quite related to what both of you have talked about so far. I like the fact that you both brought up this idea of T-shaped people. And you, Bill, you allude to the role of the workplace to shape a lot of that, and also the, you know, the journey that you take in your career to build maybe the vertical. But I suppose that, you know, there are many ways that higher education could help to build that vertical. But because it's so upstream, it's always really difficult to figure out when you're 18 years old what you're going to do with your life. And I speak from experience, because I decided just because I was interested, I would study biology. I never thought I'd end up where I am today. And so I wanted to pose the question to both of you. Maybe Marina, you can talk about the upstream side, and Bill, maybe you could talk a bit more on the workplace and career, because you've alluded to some of that in your opening remarks. There are questions in the box, and a couple of them pertain to the role of higher education. How, you know, the human skills that you talk about, the critical thinking skills, and the fact that literacy in terms of information literacy is going to be enduring skill, no matter how the industry changes, no matter how, you know, new sort of deep skills will be required. And so, Marina, I wondered if you could talk a bit about the role of higher education or some kind of upstream learning that can, you know, how does higher education have to change to align to that, or if it has to? And then Bill, maybe later you can talk about the role of the workplace in organizations. Marina?
Yeah, and you know, obviously here in the US, we're having lots and lots of conversations about higher education because it's very expensive. A lot of people go into debt, and it's not clear that when you come out with these degrees, that there are great jobs out there on the other side. So a lot of conversations about that, and you know, as people switching to online, I feel like you know, we've tied so much. This is a continuous sort of debate in education in general. What are you educating for? Are you educating to be a more informed citizen who can participate in the system in a better way, or are you basically creating workers? And, you know, that debate has never been resolved. And you can still go into meetings around higher education, and there's still going to be, but particularly in the US, because people are literally going into hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt. So of course you think like, where do I come out of this? In Singapore, it's different, right? So to me, like, of course you want to have you want to produce good human beings. And that to me does mean, if you think about that concept of T-shaped people, it's that, yeah, we need people who are coders and programmers and computer scientists, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't know history. They shouldn't take philosophy. And so to me, it is this T-shaped education. You know, maybe there is something you want to specialize in and that's needed and necessary, but it doesn't mean, I think a lot of problems with our tech sector, and I'm talking about here in Silicon Valley, is that they missed a lot of that liberal arts and humanities education. And it shows in terms of the products that they are creating. And it shows in terms of the kind of social or lack of social awareness that they're showing in what they're putting out there in the world. So I do believe that combining, you know, even if it does, I think that basic humanistic liberal arts education with a whole variety of things is absolutely needed. And I do think that that has been the role of universities and for a long time. I think the other thing that we're learning from these online classes is that learning is also social, just like a lot of work is social. And there's just that much you can do online. We talked about it 10 years ago, that these MOOCs and massively, you know, online classes, they're not a replacement to being in conversation about things and doing projects and working with people, and all of that is needed. So I'm all for keeping higher education and building those critical thinking, emotional intelligence, ability to collaborate, but also, you know, we're dealing with very complex issues now. And it requires understanding, you know, futures work to me is that area where, you know, you don't start futures work without understanding history. You don't do scenarios without really understanding, how did we get here? What were the patterns in history that we may be repeating? All of these things. So it's critical to know that.
Well, we're still on this
view.
Topic of higher education, Marina. So your take about how then the role of education has to do with what is education for? And you talked about how it's about building, well, making good human beings. And when you break down what good human beings have to are, you know, you talk about some sort of base knowledge, some kind of goodness. Also, I think you're alluding to the fact that there's also an importance of education in instilling some kind of shared understanding of what society ought to be, the kinds of roles different members have to be will play, but also the kinds of good values that we all want to have. But I think the other interesting point you talked about that had to do with learning is social, and just as work is also social. I think these ideas do then bring to question a lot of fundamental questions as to how higher education is currently designed. Right, we basically just front load everything in a 4-year, 3-year, 5-year program. But if indeed higher education does have these different roles, there is no reason why it has to be all front loaded in 4 years, 5 years of your lives. You should be able to revisit it anytime you want. You should also have to think about the fact that you do have to come together because you're learning social skills, how to behave in a group, what is acceptable and what is not. And so a lot of the points that you brought up fundamentally does question the way higher education is designed today and the way it's delivered. So I thought that was something important to point out, because then the implications is not so much, well, it is also in pedagogy and how we bring people together, like the question in the chat. But even the fundamental structures of higher education can be questioned, is what I wanted to pick up. Do you have any quick reactions to that before I move on to Bill to talk about organizations and?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at at the work of like John Dewey, who was a progressive educator 100 years ago, I think we know what good education is. The good education is, we also know that, you know, when somebody wants to, creating desire to learn, exciting people about learning is much more important than the content that you know, if you're forced to learn, it just doesn't stick with you. So it's about learning is social. A lot of learning is experiential. There's nothing better than experiencing and really internalizing these things. So, you know, we know a lot. I agree, a lot of education, some of the education and some of the universities and colleges are structured around those ideas, but a lot of them are not. And that, I think, I mean, if you create the kind of education where it's all about rote and repetition and memorizing and all of that. And I'm, by the way, not against, there are certain things that are important to memorize. It's good to know the multiplication table so you don't have to do it in your head every time. So there are parts that are really important, but it's that kind of stuff can be replaced by online. If that's what education is about, that's the most easily replaced part of it. It's the other stuff. It's about the social and emotional and human and collaborative and all of that. And yeah, we haven't done a good job of building that into our
Marina,
education system.
Could you talk a bit about some of the examples? You say that there are already learning institutions that are designed around these principles of experiential learning. Could you give some examples?
I think Northeastern University is one of those where basically part of the education is actually working, and you do this learning and working is part of your learning experience, basically. So integrated that. There are other places like, you know, it's usually small liberal arts colleges that do this kind of work. Yeah, I think even like, you know, if you take like a very large university, Arizona State, which is huge, right? Allowing multiple tracks for people to fit into how it works for them. So you could get most of it online, or you can get most of it in person, or you can mix the two. You know, there's places like colleges that allow and recognize your experience. So it's like low residency kind of colleges where you basically work or you do other things or you're doing projects, and then you come in for maybe a period of couple of weeks and you do your projects or you're doing that work. So it's combining the two. Some of the kind of less Presidio School MBA has a design MBA that combines working and people also getting their MBAs. So there are, you know, a lot of different ways that people are doing. I think the big message is that we need to allow for multiple different ways for people to organize learning, and for different people, different things may be what works, and allowing for that. So it's not one model fits everybody.
Thanks, Marina. Bill, I think this segues very nicely to your reflections on then the role of the workplace in learning and development, but you can also react to what we just talked about.
Yeah, maybe just quickly to follow through on the education and higher education track. So one example, the 3A Institute at ANU, I know that they're experimenting with micro-credentials at the moment, which is, I mean, I've been trying to do a master's for about 15 years, I think, and I keep getting delayed by actually having to work and not being able to take the time off to fit the models that the universities have provided. And it just, I was 3 units off from finishing my master's when I started at ThinkPlace about 8 years ago, and I've never done any further study since because my life has been a maelstrom. But I've been learning the whole time. Would I have been better suited to get the piece of paper or to do what I've done? I'd argue to do what I've done is the more useful thing. However, I think if I could access small chunks of that about little parts that I want to add to my toolkit that actually fit in with a work life, then that would have been really useful for me. And I think that's what now a lot of universities are turning to doing. It even goes to basic stuff like when you're onboarding people into a new company, why do you do all the orientation up front where, you know, the security guys will come and talk to you about security policy, and there'll be some vaguely aggro guy lecturing you about security policy on day one while you're just not even absorbing what's going on. We've worked with corporate entities to change the way that they do onboarding for people so that when it comes to a particular skill or a particular thing I need to do, I can access the 5-minute video on it just then, and it'll take me through it. And it's actually being a bit human-centered in how we do this stuff, because typically the people providing the training are thinking about themselves and less about their students. So you've got to actually find the forms that work for the students. And it's not just higher education. We have to see it as a whole thing all the way from early childhood through, you know, the early years of education, what's happening in high school through to higher education, ongoing education. It's all just one thing. It's all one learning journey. But it was only 5 years ago that the education department in Australia started to join up the data sets on those 4 distinct areas to start to track what actually happens between them. So there's a long way to go in terms of how we think about those, not just in the silos of how do I change higher education? How do I change primary and secondary education? How do I change early childhood? It's all the same thing. It's just preparing someone to be a lifelong learner and giving them what they need at the right moments for them to be able to absorb it better. I'm also interested in bypassing the institutions, and it's about peer-to-peer learning. So it's not just about these big institutions that are good for maintaining quality, good for connecting into the latest research, and they're a bit of a gatekeeper. But I think in reality, you can learn a lot from the people around you, which I think brings us to the, you know, how does learning in the office happen? The way that we think about it at ThinkPlace is, I think 70% is learnt on the job. And I think consulting life is great because you are doing lots of different projects and the pace of learning is huge. You're being tested alongside a lot of different things, a lot of different domains. You're always having to create something new. And the only way to get better at doing that is to do it. If I think about something as basic as how do I facilitate a workshop effectively? The first time I did it, I'd been given a lot of instruction, but the first workshop I ever did was terrible. In fact, my boss wrote an article about 15 things you shouldn't do when you facilitate a workshop. It was done very nicely, but then the next one was much better. And, you know, now I've probably done 200 workshops since then, and now it's sort of second nature. But there is no choice but to just learn by doing. And so you come back to the age-old mantra of how does your workplace give you a safe space to fail, to give you enough time to work through these things. And that means a few things. First of all, we've got to get rid of the scolding culture from our bosses. So at ThinkPlace, we have a policy of appreciative inquiry of how do we improve the performance of our people and not slam them for when they make a mistake. So how do you actually take that sort of appreciative, positive approach to building skills in people? I think apart from the actual learning part, so yeah, 70% is working and learning on the job. 20% is sort of for more mentorship and sort of working with other people in a more formal way. And 10% is the formal training part where you're actually doing the odd course, including ITF's excellent offerings, you know, to pick up particular things that we want to inject into our team, like foresighting or whatever other skills we need. But I think that's the learning pathway. I think there's another 2 things that I think are interesting to talk about here. It's the effect of this shift towards working from home and digital ways of working on how our offices are arranged. So we've actually sort of given back the lease on our shophouse office, and we're now looking for a new space because I think the future for us, we've decided, is when you need to do the quiet work and the reflection and the writing a report and something that's a personal pursuit, then you work from home. So that's when you work from home, and that's your quiet contemplative space, which brings me to some issues around how our homes are set up for giving us that, which I've been experiencing today. The office becomes a place for working together and collaboration. It's where you come in to workshop and problem solve, figure out what you're doing next. and bringing in other people. So bringing in your clients, bringing in partners that you're working with. It's the space that you work through them with that. And so that means a different sort of setup for the office. And I think the other big piece is what's been really good about the pandemic is it's suddenly a lot easier to connect to people outside of your immediate geography. So if you've got colleagues from other areas of your company that are global, it's much, much easier to bring them in and work with them on a team now because we're used to it, and it's almost equivalent to the other people who are all at home at the moment. And so it's opened up the people we can be exposed to. Bringing that back to the learning thing that we're talking about now, that means much closer connection to the thought leaders in your organization, to be able to work alongside them, to connect directly with them and have a direct relationship with them, which actually accelerates some of the mentorship that can be done within the office. But it's one thing to say it, you actually have to set up your systems to do it. But it is easier now. There's suddenly a lot of access. It's even, when you want to, I've found in the last couple of months that when I want to reach out to someone I've wanted to talk to forever because I read a book by them, I love the way they think, I've followed them for a while, they're much more likely to say yes and join in a workshop, join in a meeting. Some of that was the pandemic where everyone was bored at home, so they were more likely to connect. So I don't know if that's going to continue, but I think we've learnt that we can connect more successfully to our global teams and global colleagues, which means a lot more interactivity and networking in how we're working, not just within our own organization, but outside of it as well, which I think is really useful.
I think you talk about quite a few things that I think could address another question I wanted to amplify from the chat that had to do with the role of the business leader in cultivating an ecosystem that can then help us achieve what we call these critical thinking skills, info literacy skills. I really like the fact that you talked about the roles to build lifelong learners is not just in the workplace, it's also outside. And the fact that a lot of the learning in organizations today are delivered from the perspective of the person delivering that learning rather than the receiver. So being a bit more user-centric actually does question very fundamentally how some of these learning modules, so-called, are delivered. Like you said, how can you possibly expect a new hire to absorb everything in his first or second day without even understanding the context in which to apply all of that? It's his first day of work after all. And so that led to me to think about this question that came up in the chat about the role of the workplace, the role of business leaders, and the fact that and you responded, talking about creating safe spaces, creating a culture of inquiry means basically also giving everyone that psychological safety to ask so-called stupid questions, to also reach beyond traditional borders, like you said, between departments, between geographical borders. And a lot of the opportunities afforded today because of the pandemic and the accelerated virtualization of work has normalized a lot of that. It goes back to Marina's earlier point that actually these things were in place already. The tech was already there. It just wasn't normal to reach out to a colleague who's halfway around the world because you're just physically closer to your immediate team. And this really takes me to the next part of the conversation that I thought we could have, because time is running out, and there are some questions that are alluding to this part of the conversation. So I thought we could take a pause after diving deep into this idea of skills, how to be better prepared, the role of organizations, and the fact that a whole ecosystem supports it. It's not just organizations, it's the role of education, it's the role even of the home and the underlying social structures that support all of us. But to zoom out a little bit now, and to go into this uncertain future that I was talking about earlier today. A lot of people think, maybe this is just a blip, right? A lot of the transformation that we're seeing today, like the immune system, we just want to go back to normal. There is no, but in some diseases like COVID-19 also, When you recover, there are lingering symptoms that follow you. We see people that have fully recovered still experiencing breathing difficulties, for example. Some of these, the organ damage will follow them for the rest of their life. It's not a very pretty analogy, but it's where I was hoping the conversation could go, which is that in this feared future we're experiencing today, but also this transformed future and all the positive things that we've observed, what do you think is going to remain for the foreseeable future? There was a question in the chat about how the tech war between the US and China might remain and continue, and what does that mean for us as people and as industry players, for example. And that's one dimension I think is important to think about. But what else about work do you think you're seeing today, the transformations that you see today will continue with us in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, pandemic aside? Let's see if maybe Marina might want to kick us off, and then we'll see what Bill has to say.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say it's, we always say that nobody can predict the future, and certainly we don't do that. Primarily because we think like what happens really depends on us. We have some agency in kind of creating the kind of future we hopefully want to see. And that's like the first step in creating this future, is imagining what is it that we want to build. And, we were just completing this set of scenarios, future scenarios called post-pandemic. And we took this alternative scenarios methodology, which looks at a whole range of possibilities. The growth scenario, which is trying to get back to normal. The constraint scenario, which is we're constrained by this pandemic for a long time, focus on individual health. The collapse scenario, which is a lot of social unrest and political unrest. This is mainly for the US. And that as we were, I've never been involved in building scenarios in this kind of environment where every day it's like something that you thought was absolutely unthinkable is just happening, whether it's conversations about abolish police in the US or universal basic income, which seemed like a kind of a fringe idea that some people have come up with, now is like central to a lot of conversations. So we kind of took pause with my team and we said, these are all scenarios and it's good for us to be like looking at them, but what is it that we want to happen? And so we basically settled on what we call a transformation scenario, which is all about social well-being. So it's about not just individual health, but it's about social health. And again, I'm coming from the US right now in this particular stage, and it's really based on some kind of old ideas of mutualism and mutuality. Right? Like that's what I would like to see happen. And there's like I see four core sort of beliefs around this mutualism idea. One is that we're all interdependent. We're all in these conditions of mutual interdependence, that whether it's health or well-being of one person depends on the collective well-being of a lot of different people. The other kind of idea is that moving from this notion of sort of exploitation to increasingly the notion of stewardship, stewardship of resources. We're used to like, okay, it's exploiting these resources and using them and being productive and all of that. And the stewardship idea is like, how do you improve the situation? How do you improve the resources? How do you improve your organization or the environment you're in? So it's really moving to that. In the US, it's moving the ideas of things that were kind of considered private goods, a lot of them, moving into rights. So it's about creating kind of a new Bill of Rights. So those are kind of, and the reason it's important is because what we're seeing is this level of divisiveness in itself is corrupting that sort of social immune system. So what I would like to see, and what I see a lot of people here working on, is moving to this transition where, it's transforming, it's not destroying kind of the foundation, but it's improving it, making it more resilient, making it better.
Liana, do you want to repeat the question? Because I think both of us, we have a tendency to sort of go in different directions.
Yeah,
So
no
just
problem.
coming
I
back
might
to
have
what's the
gone in a
central
different
question?
direction.
Yeah, the central question is, what is it we're seeing about the way COVID-19 has transformed our lives today? What is it that is going to remain with us? It's actually similar to the question that just popped up in the chat that has to do with what do you think are the irreversible changes arising from the pandemic that will follow us in 5 to 10 years, that will not go back to the normal?
Yeah, and I think for me, I would like to believe that the real enduring thing that'll come from it, we had a moment of a global pause, and most people around the globe kind of experienced a very similar thing, which was this sudden pause in what we were doing, the sudden disruption. And I think it was the first time that many people had had time to reflect and actually think about what was going on. And you know, there's been a debate for a long time about what actually creates happiness for people. And it comes down to something pretty basic. Above a certain level of income, which is lower than we think, extra income doesn't make us happier. And actually, it's connections with friends and family and meaning that actually gives us happiness. So the way that we've structured our economies and societies don't give us that. They're about increasing growth, increasing income, increasing consumption, and you know, there's a whole economic argument about that, which we probably don't have time to fully get into. But I think for me, the really big theme is it's time. I think it's given people time to reevaluate what is my identity, what's my self-worth, who am I? If my professional identity is going to be undermined and being changed, then who am I and how am I sort of thinking about what's my value in life? It's also things that we didn't think could change all of a sudden did. And just to go back to an example you gave around suddenly having court hearings on Zoom. So we were working with the courts in the lead up to that and suggesting that they should go to Zoom conferencing. And they wouldn't do it because they said there's no way that you could show the gravity of the court in a Zoom setting. And then they had to, and they did, and it probably works. So there's a lot of things that we just thought weren't possible that I think now we realize probably are. I mean, even for ThinkPlace and me personally, we resisted working from home for a long, long time because we believe that our work is fundamentally collaborative, that we need to be together, that you need that real-time connectivity all the time to work effectively. And while we've lost some things working from home, which we're going to bring back with our future office, I think actually we've shown that we can work effectively. We've moved all of our workshops, all of our user research online. And all of a sudden we've realized that there's some benefits to that. We can now do the same thing anywhere in the world reasonably effectively. We can bring people together from anywhere in the world. And the tools that we're using, and this is really basic stuff, you know, it's from Zoom to using things like virtual whiteboards like Mural and Miro and other platforms like Reno, which lets you simulate being in a workshop online, even to running workshops in Minecraft and running workshops in Mozilla Hubs, which is a VR version of it, that it can be done. And the experiments that we're doing around it show that it actually brings a lot of value. But that's the tech side. I think just to go back to reflect on a comment online on the chat line here, there are new norms that we now have to develop that go alongside those things. So yes, the technology provides the opportunity, but how many times on a Zoom call have you had to remind yourself to unmute? Little basic things like that, but it's the banal, menial stuff that makes the difference in a workday. So there's a bunch of little norms, rituals that we're catching up with now. You know, for ThinkPlace, we realized that we were missing the social connection. And so we started doing online lunches. We would try and get the food delivered to everyone on the island at the same time, and then try and have that shared experience of a meal together. We've gone to a daily stand-up model. So we kick off every day all together just with 10, 15 minutes on what we're doing for the day. When it comes to our team meetings, I think I annoy my staff, actually. I'm always asking them on Monday morning, what happened on the weekend? And usually I'm met with silence for the first 5 minutes. And so then I start with my own. But it's just reminding people that this is the stuff that if we were in the office would have been easy and we'd be used to, but because we're all on Zoom, we think it's more formal. So we're crafting new norms to catch up with the tools that we've suddenly found ourselves using. And I think that's the stuff that we've got to focus on now. I think this might be some territory we can get to in the last 10 minutes, but I think it's also about what does this mean for Singapore? And I think, you know, again, as a city-state, there is now an opportunity to have much more global reach. So Singapore has always been an airport and a crossroads for air, for marine, for financial services, increasingly for sort of technology and innovation. But I think now is a really good time for Singapore to think about, in the virtual world, what's the equivalent of the airport, the seaport, that crossroads that Singapore has always been. And that's happening at the same time as there's a lot more tension around foreign versus local. And I think it's a debate that has to be had well at the moment, because Singapore is fundamentally connected to the rest of the world. So yes, it is a government's duty to take care of its citizens. And as a city-state, Singapore's value is always going to be connected to the globe. So what does that look like in the future? So that's not necessarily about the future of work. That's also about the future of Singapore, I think.
That's right. I think those are very good reflections. One of them I wanted to pick up on is this idea of globalness that will stay with us. And we like to think about how we need to think about employment still in a very geographical way. I think besides, you know, in Singapore, for example, to your question, what does it mean for Singapore? We like to think about the global market as our market, right? But do we also think about the global jobs market as our market? And how can we do better in trying to tap that as well? If we can similarly tap remote workers from overseas, can we similarly tap these job opportunities overseas as well? I think that is also a very fundamental question. And before I go over to Marina, I think another to your earlier point about the fact that we are also going to, amid all this, face serious global challenges such as climate change. And I personally think that will also be another irreversible effect of COVID-19. And what I mean by that is the fact that we are going into so much debt globally because of the recovery efforts. We are going to take many years to recover from people going through trauma from the experience, whether they're because they're essential workers or they were sick or they are frontline healthcare staff. We're going to have to rebuild homes and lives, and by the time all that happens, the global priorities to look at the next big challenge or the enduring challenge that has been plaguing us for a while, that is climate change, is going to be diminished. So, that would be my input into what might be an irreversible impact of the pandemic. Marina, do you want to have the last say about what irreversible themes you see happening from COVID-19?
Sure. I agree with both of you on a lot of these things. I think in terms of sort of the global event, like I think this is the first time, maybe ever, where the whole world is experiencing the same event, like that kind of global experience that everybody's affected by the pandemic, like in a pretty major way. Like there's something unifying about that, although we're not necessarily unified around it. And I think that what the other kind of theme is that I think our sense of security has been really shaken. Just a collective sense of security, individual security by this pandemic. And I think that will have a lot of longer term impacts in terms of how people think, what they're focused on, all these kinds of things. But it's a huge trauma for a lot of people. And the longer it continues, the more of an impact it's going to have. I do think that, and I'm seeing this, that actually there's going to be globalization in terms of, digital work and other things, but I also see people rethinking global supply chains and bringing a lot of that and localizing them because of the pandemic and the kind of, these global supply chains are great. They're very efficient, but they're not very resilient. And for resilient systems, you need to have slack and you have extra capacity and all of these things. And people are going to be, I think there's going to be a lot of focus on that, on localizing more, thinking about kind of resilience of these. In terms of the digital media, and I totally agree, it will have a huge impact. Like one area is like telehealth. You know, experts for 10 years in the US have been promoting this, but the take up was very low. And now we have literally millions and millions of people doing health online. And so like this one event just shifted that whole equation very, very quickly. But, you know, watching a lot of the conferences and online, it's almost feels to me, I told one of my colleagues, it feels like it's a transition from silent movies to talkies, right? And it was like this period where there was these famous silent actors, right? And you try to transition them to online, and it's a very, very different experience. So I think we need to, I mean, we're going to go through this period of adjusting to this new medium and translating it, in inventing new forms that are unique to this medium. I think we're still at the point where we're sort of transitioning a lot of in-person interactions and kind of skills into this medium. But I think over time, it's like we're going to go into talkies rather than silence movies. It's a very different medium.
I don't think I can do justice to summarize the entire conversation we've had. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I really want to thank Marina and Bill for spending time with us. I think we talked a lot about very different dimensions of the future of work. We've talked about how there are social dimensions and there were underlying social factors that have brought us here today. But we've also talked about what you think the skills of the future might be, as exhibited in the skills that have been very important today in this future that we are already experiencing, and the roles that higher education in general, and workplaces have to play to encourage that lifelong learner within all of us. And I think a lot of the things that we haven't spoken about that are also important that you've mentioned here and there have to do with the polarization, the inequalities that the COVID-19 has brought about, even in the workplace. That fact that we can, you know, as someone pointed in the chat, the fact that we could sit here and have an intellectual conversation about the future of work already speaks to the fact that we are the fortunate few knowledge workers that are able to operate on this platform. And those inequalities were already there. These inequalities might continue if we do not do anything. And probably will. But then that begs the question, Marina, that you raised: what is it that we value in society? What kinds of work did we always think were important but just never said it, and became front and center during the pandemic? These are questions that we continue to need to struggle with as a society. If indeed these jobs are more valued, are they remunerated at the same level of value that we all seem to hold them to, is another big question. And then, of course, some of the enduring changes that COVID-19 will bring have to be paired with the fact that a lot of the changes that COVID-19 has brought are accelerated changes of things that have already been brewing. Like Marina, you said, we have to look back into history to think about how we've got here. And a lot of that history is going to follow us in addition to our experiences with COVID-19. And the good or bad thing is that all of us are experiencing COVID-19 today. That can be a unifying force some way, but it also is a polarizing force in some ways. So we've touched on a very big range of questions. I always think that it's better that people walk away with more questions than answers after a session, because that really is what will inspire you to continue learning as well. And as Bill rightly mentioned, it's about unlocking that lifelong learner in all of us. So really, thank you so much for being with us today.
You can access it through this QR code and the link that we are going to put up as a slide in the chat box and in the chat box. All right. Once again, thank you for your participation, and we really look forward to seeing you later at 6 p.m. Singapore time for the second conversation on living with the pandemic. So to everyone, have a very great day or night ahead. Goodbye.